Welcome, everyone. Hello and good day. I'm Jean Parker, and welcome to our podcast. This is the podcast series called Addressing the Present and Building the Future. It's a collaboration between the Wilmette Institute and EBBF, also known as Ethical Business Building the Future. Today, we have a wonderful presentation for you. It's called Impact Experience, Creating Justice and Building Bridges in Marginalized Communities. And our presenter today is Jenna Nicholas. She is the CEO of Impact Experience, and through Impact Experience, she facilitates the building of lasting relationships between investors, philanthropists, innovators, and marginalized communities. It's quite a handful. Impact Experience is right now addressing issues like reconstruction after disasters in New Orleans, Houston, and Puerto Rico. Those were hurricanes. They also do workforce training in former coal-driven communities in West Virginia and inclusive investment processes in opportunity zones and sustainable agriculture in Georgia. That is a huge amount of work. I also want to direct you to the EBBF podcast that Jenna Nicholas did with me several years ago, the podcast Discovering How, and she did a wonderful interview with us at that time. She has a rich history of democratizing finance and investing around the world. She is a graduate of Stanford University with honors in international relations, and she has an MBA also from Stanford University from the School of Business. And she's a recipient of the Stanford Social Innovation Fellowship. She is an active member of the Baha'i Faith. Jenna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jean, and to EBBF and the Wilmette Institute. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And it feels like it's a very powerful moment in time for us to be having this conversation. One of the elements that we've been reflecting on a lot as a team and within our community in the impact investing space is that really right now we're seeing in the world two pandemics. We're seeing the COVID-19 crisis, which has been lasting for the last few months, and then the pandemic and the crisis of racism, which has been lasting for the last 400 years. And the power of the lens and focus that people have become aware of because of both of these crises, I think has created spaces and opportunities for people to really witness quite viscerally much of the crumbling of an old world order and the desire to contribute and build towards a new world order. And a big part of the inspiration for our work at Impact Experience is really this question of how do we build bridges between groups of people who historically have been quite disconnected from one another. So whether that's, as Jean mentioned, between investors and entrepreneurs and innovators, or between people that have these preconceived notions or biases towards one another. And my background is working in the impact investing space, investing in socially responsible businesses and funds, and lived in China doing this work for a while, and in Washington, DC, investing in pretty broad range of sectors and geographies: financial inclusion, education, technology, sustainable agriculture. And then I helped to build a coalition of over 170 foundations that were divesting from fossil fuels and investing in new economy solutions, really with this goal of how do we have an alignment between our values and the investments that we're making. And the big case that was being made there was that by owning investments in fossil fuels, we are owning climate change. And what's powerful to see right now in terms of a lot of the engagement as it relates to thinking about questions around police brutality is the reflections on also what does this look like from an investment perspective too. So if one cares deeply about questions around racial justice, how do we ensure that we have investment portfolios that are aligned with that. So we've been collaborating, for example, with Illumin Capital, which is a impact investing fund of funds, investing into private equity and venture capital funds in the impact investing space, where there's a requirement for 10 years of deep dive work around implicit bias reduction. That if we look at the global investments that are made, of the $69 trillion that are invested annually, 1.3% is invested into women and people of color. And so this lack of capital that is being invested, particularly into people of color and particularly into Black people, is a huge challenge within the global financial system. And so our impact experience, a big part of our work is to bring the fund managers and investors from within the Illumin Capital portfolio, but also other investors and entrepreneurs to really look at, through building more proximity with communities that have been historically underinvested in, how can we both invest into those communities, but also look at ways in which we can shift the way that we think about our investments to unlock more of this capital. So one community, and later on we'll watch a video about this, but one community that we've been very actively engaged in is in Montgomery, Alabama. And we've been bringing groups, before it was in person and now it's virtual, to really visit Montgomery, Alabama, and to look at the history of lynching and slavery and present day manifestations in mass incarceration and police brutality and the lack of capital that's invested into women and people of color, and be able to draw this through line to realize, as James Baldwin says, that unless we are willing to face and look at history, our ability to be able to design solutions moving forward will be that much harder. And so we have been now, and particularly over these past few months, leading these programs, both internally now also within organizations, as organizations are looking at how do we think about questions around structural racism and bias within our portfolios, and realizing that the power of actually looking at within every aspect of our system, within our hiring processes, our investment decision-making processes, our board selection, how these biases exist, and recognizing that there's a need, and as we know intimately from the Baha'i writings, for both this the personal transformation and shift, but also the systemic shifts within the systems that we all exist and work within. So that's been a big part of the work that we've been engaged in, and would love to invite you all to take part in these experiences that we have. We're now hosting them every couple of weeks in different communities in a virtual context, and as I mentioned, it's both internal as well as between communities. A couple of other elements I wanted to mention, some other work that have been engaged in recently that has been really exciting, I think very aligned with many people on this call, is working with a group called One Planet, who have an aspect of the work that's around investing into businesses. And a big part of what we've been looking at there is how to think about using Baha'i-inspired principles from an investment sort of philosophy. And what does it mean to embed principles? For example, I'm sure many of you have read the March 1st, 2017 letter from the Universal House of Justice, where there are quotations in there, for example, like every choice a Baha'i makes as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary leaves a trace. And the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims. So in thinking about a passage like that, and what does that look like to embed into an investment philosophy as we're looking at One Planet, or impact experience as we look at creating spaces for people to be able to explore what does that mean in their lives. We run, for example, boot camps where we give people the opportunity to really think about, in collaboration with our partners at Stanford. So another resource, and Daniel's very kindly sharing some resources with the group, but we have a research partnership with Stanford, and particularly with an incredible researcher, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who wrote a book called Bias and also had a TED Talk that came out last week. She's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. So we partner with her and her team to ensure the research-driven basis of our work around implicit bias reduction. So before each of the experiences that we have, we do interviews with each of the participants, we do baseline surveys to understand what is the context in which people are coming into our engagements with. And then after the experiences, we similarly do interviews and have surveys to understand what is that behavioral shift and how are people thinking differently and then making decisions differently within their organizations as a result of having gone through the experience. So that research-driven aspect of the work has been a core aspect of our work. So it's I think one of the elements as I just transition into showing the video that's been really exciting to see right now is that many people who have been on the sidelines around thinking about many of these issues have been galvanized in a way that are thinking about through the decision-making processes within their corporations from an investment perspective. How do we respond to these crises that exist in the world right now, and to truly create spaces and opportunities to build bridges across differences? And the methodology that we have designed at Impact Experience in many ways based on lots of principles of the Baha'i faith around trust building, consultation, ensuring that there's an action orientation. So it's not just something that starts and ends in words, but is really galvanizing towards ongoing commitments and engagements, whether those are investment commitments or ongoing partnership opportunities. We've now worked in 30 communities and engaged about 900 people in our processes, and we see really this ever abiding sort of community that is holding each other in this time and supporting each other in ways that provides this powerful sense that we're not alone in responding to the crises that exist within the world. So we'll show now a video, and this was from one of our most recent experiences in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was in collaboration between Illumin Capital and Impact Experience. As I mentioned, we've now since then transitioned this into a online portal and modules. So it's over the course of 2 days, and we've partnered with our amazing local partners in Montgomery, Alabama, to give this context of the community in which we're working in. And the groups in Montgomery do incredible work, particularly supporting people who are coming out of prison and supporting them around mental health work and finding jobs once they re-enter from prison. So it's been incredible to work with them and to kind of ground in the work of Montgomery as we engage in this work. So I'll hand over to Daniel, and excited to engage further with you all after the video. Thank you.
We are here in Montgomery, Alabama for a convening where we're first taking a moment of pause together as a group of influential investors and individuals.
First and foremost, the work at Illumin Capital is really at the intersection of the financial markets and racial equity. And so this journey to Montgomery gave me personally an experience to really kind of ground myself in the legacy of slavery and really kind of see the through line from slavery to the period after Reconstruction and the racial terror that happened in this country.
My full name is John Lee Gaston White, and I am a son of the South. And I believe wholeheartedly in the work and the struggle of my ancestors.
Bringing people together is one of the most important things that we can do, especially in this moment. Having open and honest dialogue and really confronting not only the ignorance, but also the lies that have been told about what's going on in this country.
I'm an impact investor. I use the economy and culture to build a more just and joyful society. I saw at the memorial the pillar from Pike County, Mississippi, which is where my family is from. And I saw the names of the several people who were lynched there. And it both brought home the gravity that I already knew, but it's presented and reminded in a different way when you see it as part of a larger memorial exhibit. I really hope that over time, in a short time, that more people flock to this place and start to discover our history, because it's an important part of who we are as an American people.
This experience will impact my work by allowing me to understand where my biases and my blind spots are on my own personal development. What I would like to do as a result of this training is go back to my institution and really think critically about how we're operating and looking at investment opportunities and making sure that we are building an organization that's inclusive of everyone in the U.S.
My name is Clint Korver. I'm the co-founder and managing director at Ulu Ventures. We're a seed stage venture firm focused in Palo Alto, and one of our investment theses is what we call diversity, with the idea being that diversity, it's a social good, sure, but it's also our thesis on how we're going to generate superior returns in venture.
So at Illumin, we believe that the asset allocation of capital is really tied to history, and Montgomery, Alabama is a critical portion of U.S. history.
So many of us maybe don't see it, and being able to hold that and understand that and not embrace it, but figure out how you can make it better.
I think pipeline is really, really important. Like, how do you create a diverse pipeline? Who are the people that you're talking to build the network, to make sure that you're seeing all the right entrepreneurs in the room, to make sure that you're giving them the right opportunity. The second thing that came up from today's conversation was just, I've been thinking about it a lot, is this idea of incentives and shifting incentives. Like, if somebody right now is fighting for basic necessities and does not have the job and the experience, how do you account for that in their job experience when they're applying for something or when they're starting a company? And I think those are the two things that I've been thinking about most in this context, which is both pipeline and incentives, to make sure that we're seeing everyone and giving people a fair shot.
I think that if we look at some of the progress that has been made, obviously we've made tremendous political progress with being able to elect African American president. But we haven't made that same progress in narrowing those gaps on racial, social, and economic inequalities.
The legacy of racism and how it has impacted negatively the kids that we are trying to change the trajectory for. But mostly, I was really intrigued to come because I grew up in a family where my father, as an everyday kind of guy, did in his work every day try to bust racism in this country.
I'm really fascinated with the civil rights history that runs in the soil of Montgomery, and so I was very excited for the opportunity to kind of blend personal and professional passions in a trip in Montgomery. It's been really incredible 2 days.
One of the things that really struck me about this impact experience and the museum, the memorial, just being here in Montgomery, Alabama, and hearing people reference the museum as the lynching museum, was a real visceral understanding of the terror involved in maintaining the system of slavery.
This experience, this is my second time at the Impact Experience. However, this is different because here we've come to Montgomery and we're able to not just talk about it, but also experience in real time what happened here several decades ago.
Given that I'm an impact investor toward decarceration, we have to acknowledge, of course, that mass incarceration was grandfathered in by slavery. And so coming to Montgomery is really coming to the epicenter of slavery.
When we look carefully at this history, and as so many before us have sang the words, "We shall overcome," our group seeks to create the interventions, the innovations that take on the "we shall overcome" of the asset management business and move this number from where it currently sits at 1.3% to more than $35 trillion in firms managed by women and people of color led and owned firms.
One of the things that consistently inspires me about bringing these groups together with impact experience in Montgomery is how people bring their full selves to the experience. So this doesn't just become an experience where people come and they're inspired and then they go home, but actually people are really reflecting on what are the commitments that they want to make, what are the decisions that they're going to make differently as a result of having gone through this experience together. And so it's really encouraging to me that it can be so easy when we look at so many of the challenges in the world and the challenges within investing and fund allocation to become saddened by the state of affairs. But being with these groups here in Montgomery becomes a huge recharge for me and for our work, to really feel like there is hope and there are reasons to be hopeful. So feel so grateful for our team and for our community and for the people that keep coming back with us here in Montgomery as part of a lifelong journey. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. And just to draw the connection there, Jim and Evelyn, who were in the video, work for Baha'i Steve Sarowitz. And so we often find that we have Baha'is involved in many aspects of our work, and that's a kind of really exciting aspect of it all. And but so excited to engage with you all and would love to open up for some questions now, and looking forward to diving deeper.
Thank you, Jenna, for opening the space and creating the possibility of a discussion around what investment can mean and how we can make it work for the people, not just for big capital concentration. One of the first questions that I was thinking of as I was watching the video was, it seems that your current focus is in the US and in the US only. Is that correct?
We do a lot of work in the US. We have done some work internationally, and I think particularly now with everything going more virtual opens up even more possibilities. So we've done some work in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, and we've been exploring some work in Australia and in some other places too. So the majority of the work's been in the US, but we're very open to work elsewhere too.
Wonderful. And so it was mentioned that implicit bias seems to be the focus of these meetings. Is it the same focus in other regions as well?
The work around bias and structural racism is definitely a lens that runs throughout all of our work. I'd say another lens that runs throughout all is how do we develop mechanisms for unlocking capital into communities and people who have been historically underinvested in. So that kind of runs throughout. But then we also, as Jean mentioned at the beginning, we have sort of deep dive thematic issue areas that we engage around depending on the communities that we're working in. So in addition to the areas that Jean mentioned at the beginning, we've also been working on issues around mental health and young people of color. A lot of our work is around sort of the just transition, so a transition from reliance upon a fossil fuel economy to a more sort of equitable and sort of renewable energy economy. But we noticed that these elements around bias and structural racism come into almost every issue that we're engaged around.
Great. So we had a question from Bradley Wright Hewlett in the US. His question was, our small Midwestern city has been labeled one of the worst for Blacks. How can our small Baha'i community make a difference?
No, it's a great question. I think a big part of it is creating spaces for this dialogue to take place. So I think part of the both actually exciting element of this time, so in addition to taking our impact experiences virtually, we had been hosting these discussion groups in our community here, and we have taken that virtually too, and we've been engaging music as part of that. And actually music is a core part of all of our experiences. Actually, a couple of behind musicians that have been involved in our work, Eric Dozier and Luke Slot, and particularly Eric actually has been quite involved with our work in Montgomery. And for those of you who don't know, a lot of Eric's work is around racial justice and the power of music as a lens through which we can process everything that's going on right now. So I think thinking about, depending upon the particular questions and the communities, the ability to create those spaces for people to be able to process, because there's a collective grief that we're all witnessing right now. And so the ability to just hold that space for people to process that kind of the trauma of the experience. And that's obviously at different levels depending on where we are and the context in which we're operating within. But there's a big need right now, I think, for that to happen.
And can you maybe walk us a little bit in what the process is between the space that you create for those conversations, deep conversations, and investments? How is that process walked through?
Yeah, so for us, the fundamental thesis of our work is that if we're making investments that are purely transactional and are not taking into consideration the humanity of the people involved, we're missing so much of what's possible with the investment process. So the ability to humanize on both sides, both from an investor perspective as well as from an investee perspective, the effectiveness of those investments that are being made and that of long-term ongoing engagement will be that much greater as a result. And so that's a big part of the sort of need really to humanize the investment process, is that then that it becomes more than just a capital allocation question, but also what might be the other ways in which we can partner and collaborate, and that ability to look at things from a more holistic perspective. Opens up opportunities. Also, purely even from a financial perspective, there's more likely to achieve greater returns when we're able to consider that humanity, in addition to the greater sort of social impact that comes from that.
So does that mean that from a deeper knowledge of the community, better decisions are made on where to invest, how to proceed? Is that kind of the...
Exactly.
And so a question that was coming from Nabil actually is, what kind of investment indicators do you use then?
So a number, so that it very much depends on the particular issue areas that we're engaged around and what sectors we're working in. So there are, just in terms of looking at impact metrics, there's a lot of work that's been done within the impact investing space around this. There's still more work that can be done. But to give just an example, there's an organization called the Global Impact Investing Network that have developed these indicators called impact reporting investment standards. And these are impact metrics that enable you to, within, let's say, the education technology industry, benchmark investments that are being made against one another. So one can assess what is how impactful is this company in comparison to other companies in the education space. And they'll do a similar thing across healthcare and agriculture and what have you. So that's sort of one quantitative ways in which one can look at investments. I also mentioned, we do these surveys before and after and these interviews with participants. And a big part of that is to also capture some of the more qualitative aspects of this and what is the kind of ripples of impact over time, because some of that impact will seem within a very short time frame, and other aspects it will take quite a while before that all comes to fruition. So there's a term that's used, patient capital, and that the ability to take a kind of long-term perspective where one is truly building alongside the entrepreneurs that one is engaged with becomes a really important aspect of the work.
Okay, and there is a question coming from Robert Greene, which I think is a bit of a tease, which says, how is this not white savior complex?
It's a really important question, and there are lots of resources around. There's a book that some of you may have heard of called White Fragility that a lot of people have been reading right now around this. So for us, the lens is always guided and grounded from the community outward. So rather than it being outside-in approach, or from the sort of white saviors kind of coming in and solving the problems, it's kind of coming from the perspective of what are the communities actually looking for and engaging in, and building all of the engagements from that perspective outward. So an inside out rather than outside in. So that's sort of one aspect, and it comes back also to this piece around the trust building aspect, where this isn't a purely transactional element where people kind of come in and then leave and then that's it, and they can kind of tick the box and feel good about themselves. But these are deep, lifelong, and like intergenerational relationships that are being fostered, so that then the way that engagement happens is something that can persist beyond just the 3 days that we're all together, for example.
And I would guess that's perhaps one of the indicators you might be looking at is the idea of capacity building, and how capacity is built through the investments. Is that something that you look at in any way?
Certainly, capacity building is a big aspect. Also, it is a fundamental idea in the Baha'i writings around the concept that people are protagonists of their own future and destiny. So that is a fundamental belief that is enshrined within all of our engagements, is that ability to be able to, how do we create the spaces to unlock that potential, rather than like the idea that we're sort of creating that potential. And actually, this was a line that I heard from Layli Miller of the Tahrir Justice Center. There's a concept that many of you have, I'm sure, have heard of, oh, don't just give a man a fish, teach him how to fish. And Layli said, actually, I don't think it's just about teaching people how to fish. It's about removing the barriers that have prevented people who know how to fish from fishing. I think that's so aligned with what we try to do with our work. Is, for the community partners that we engage with, like, they have the answers most of the time. It's more that, and that's where we come back to the structural racism and what have you, is that it's more that the systems have prevented people from being able to actualize whatever it is that they are seeking to achieve. And so being able to create the spaces to unlock that potential becomes a huge aspect of the work.
And that connects to a question that Daniel shared as well, which is, what do investors who attend your session highlight as their key insights? What is the one thing they find out as they go through those sessions?
So a few pieces. I think one aspect, and it's partly why we emphasize it so much, but is this piece around people becoming more aware of the biases that they have. And I think there are so many people who are well-intentioned people who think, oh, I don't have any biases, and that actually through a process of engaging in our methodology and hearing from our research partners, and we have a number of exercises that we facilitate for people to explore some of these questions, and they realize that both personally and then how that's embedded within their organizations, and then are equipped with tools to be able to engage around that. So it's not just an awakening, but rather here are now some tangible steps that we can take to actually engage from that perspective. So I think that's certainly kind of a key aspect and a shift for people. I think it's also the relationships that people form with others that they had not previously been in rooms and in community with, and that then becomes something that people come back to a lot and re-engage with one another. And I mentioned earlier around the power of the arts, but I think this heightened awareness around the power of the arts as a mechanism for creating these sort of breakthrough opportunities is also a kind of core aspect of the work.
Jean, did you want to share a comment or ask a question?
Sure. I am wondering how your work is changing as a result of the events in the past few months and the prospect of what might happen next. How are the conversations in your organization changing? Is there more urgency to the work that you're doing?
Definitely. So I think a few pieces. One is obviously we've translated everything from in-person to online, which has actually been very exciting in that the ability to reach broader groups of people who maybe travel was an impediment in the past, but now able to engage. I think another more fundamental shift is that the work for many people has gone from a kind of nice to have to an essential part of engaging. So a lot of people that we had been having conversations with over the past few years who said, oh, maybe we'll work together one day, have been calling us up and saying, like, can we do this work next week, right? So I think that's been just quite exciting to witness, that for many groups where this may not have been a priority previously, have been kind of galvanized by this current moment to want to find ways of engaging and deepening and finding responses to the time and finding a source of hope, honestly. Because I think that it can be very easy when just looking at the media and all the reports that we see to see all the terrible things that are going on in the world right now, but an ability to actually channel that sadness, frustration, anger into something tangible, I think has been also a big part of the inspiration for the doubling down around some of the work.
Thank you. Jean, did you have a follow-up?
Well, just that, can you kind of untangle what's causing that? Is it the virus that's causing it, the pandemic? Is it the galvanization of racial justice, a quest for racial justice in the world? Is it both? Is it everything? Is it something else? Is it possible to understand what's the thing that's actually causing this acceleration, or is it something that's been building all along and that has just now been triggered by events?
No, right. No, I think it's great. I think partly all. I think it's also the confluence of the issues that you're talking about. So I think the fact that we had everything with COVID and particularly with COVID, seeing the impact on communities that had already been marginalized, and that all being aggrandized in this moment in time. And so I know in the US context, for example, that in looking at the distribution of funds, the challenges, particularly for communities of color and businesses of color, as being a really significant hardship in that time. And then layered on top of that, the police brutality and what felt like a spaciousness to be able to articulate en masse the challenges that had been obviously latent within our economy and our communities for hundreds of years, but this sort of collective awakening and seeing the corporate responses with companies, all making these statements. My co-founder is on the board of Ben & Jerry's and making a statement around ending white supremacy, but a lot of companies taking these very active statements that they were making. But then it becomes this question of, okay, so what does that actually mean in terms of how do we embed that into the practices of our day-to-day work? And how are we ensuring that our senior management team is aligned from a diversity perspective, and our boards, and for investors, like their portfolio. So I think this question of the how after the sort of the what are we doing has become a really important aspect of the conversations, and I think has been a lot of what's driven a lot of this inbound interest and engagement at this time.
So adding to that, and the question becomes, and this is a question that comes from Facebook again, Robert Green comes back and asks how building relationships is part of a richer investment process rather than just having metrics and indicators that look at profitability and return on investment. What do you think of that?
No, it's a great question. And I certainly think like relationships are the key aspect of any of this work. And a big part of the reason that we emphasize bias so much, and the numbers that I mentioned earlier of the less than 2% of the $69 trillion that are invested in women and people of color, a big part of the reason that that is the case is because people are investing in people who look like them, are part of the networks that they're part of. And so that was a big part of the inspiration for us in founding the platform of Impact Experience, was how do we create these opportunities for people to build relationships with people other than themselves that can then help to unlock capital into people that have been historically underinvested in. And that, again, linking it back to the financial piece, that actually realizing that our biases are preventing us from maximizing our financial returns. Because if one was to actually look at what would be possible if our biases weren't getting in the way of our investments, we would see, and we've done the math on this, that it would be a $35 trillion that would be invested, right? So it's a huge increase, because then it would be more of 50% of people's portfolios. So there's a huge opportunity to realize the power of actually, through building those relationships, what can be possible, again, both from a social impact, but also from a financial returns perspective.
Great, and there were two specific questions about audiences or participants or groups to work with. One being Indigenous communities, and the other being reaching out to youth in that process. In the process you're describing, maybe can you tell us something about that? Those groups?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, a couple of pieces from our own work. So we have done some work in Arizona in collaboration with Arizona State University that was particularly focused on Indigenous communities, and in collaboration with the head of tribal affairs at the university there. And the numbers that I was mentioning earlier around the lack of capital invested into women and people of color, I mean, the Indigenous communities is a huge aspect of that in terms of the lack of capital that is invested into Indigenous communities. And we've been seeing now also with the effects of COVID, the disproportionate effect on Indigenous communities. And so it's both a huge part in terms of the challenges. There's also, I think, a huge part in terms of the opportunities, where there's obviously so much from Indigenous wisdom that, particularly in these moments in time, that we can really learn from. And I think even just the idea of taking a 7 generations mindset, like the power of embedding that, which is such a core part of Indigenous philosophy, into how we're thinking about investments, how we're thinking about broader decision-making processes, becomes a huge aspect of the work. And then on the side of youth, so for more broadly in our work, it's a huge part of ensuring that we have this intergenerational engagement in all of the experiences that we have. We're actually planning towards a very specifically family-focused impact experience, like partly because people are, so many more people are at home right now, and we have had a lot of requests from people in our community of saying, we'd love to have our kids more involved, and like, how do we create more intentionality around that? So that's something, and if people are interested in following up around that, would love to have you take part. But particularly the elements that I mentioned earlier around like mental health and young people of color, we've seen, I was just reading the numbers this week, the Congressional Black Caucus did some research to say there's been a 73% increase in the rate of suicides around Black youth, which is just crazy. And so much of that has obviously been aggrandized by COVID and police brutality. And so, so the need for us to really like recenter around that as a lens in our work becomes an essential aspect.
Yeah, and it's definitely intergenerational investment is something that is still not a mainstream concept, I would think, in the current investment culture around the world. So that's interesting. And the 7th generation that you were talking about, I'm not aware of the reference. Can you explain it a bit, please?
So the idea is that within Indigenous culture that we should take a mindset around decision making of considering 7 generations. And they think particularly about, and this is a very simplified version, so it's a much more complex that I don't fully know, but is the idea of both considering our ancestors, so the 3 generations that have come before us, as well as our descendants, so the 3 generations that are to come afterwards. And so whenever we are engaging in, and this is particularly used as it relates to thinking about questions around the environment and the preservation of the environment, but I think it actually applies to so many of the issues that we are all navigating right now, that the importance of being able to take that lens. So rather than thinking about, as so often, like financial markets will be looking at things from a quarterly perspective, if we were to shift our frame and thinking to instead be thinking about things from a 7 generations mindset, how would that shift what conclusions that we come to?
That's great. And I think that connects to Arthur Dahl's question on how do you link impact investing and employment creation when so many can not even find work in the present conditions. So how do we make decisions that will impact not, the future generations, of course, but also the current one?
Definitely. And one of the things that's been quite exciting to see from within the impact investing community, and much of this had been started before COVID and what have you, but a lot of institutions and individuals have been doubling down since COVID, but as looking at innovative financing structures, so like income share agreements, where there's an ability to be able to support people in their journeys, where making an investment into people where there's a share of their future income that can be generated back as returns to investors. So it's more investing into people rather than just investing into companies. Looking at more alternative forms of work, and particularly as we've all shifted into the digital world, what are ways of retraining? And we see a huge uptick in terms of a lot of the education technology companies that are within the portfolio of investments that we engage with, particularly with Illumin Capital, where it's been quite incredible to see how so many of these companies have responded, both as it relates to supporting for young people and their education and for school, but also for older people who are having to shift the jobs that they're looking at, because so many of their jobs are required to be in person, and now are looking at retooling for this new economy. But the role of these companies that can play in terms of the shifting of those opportunities, and so being able to unlock more capital into those companies to help to create more of those opportunities becomes really important.
There's a lot to think about there, but we have questions keep coming in. So Cynthia Ford on YouTube is asking about her community in Cincinnati, and they're looking for ways to support entrepreneurism in their community. And so she's wondering what the steps would be to create a space like the one that you guys are working in, or how could she collaborate and have you over, so to say?
Yeah, so I'm happy to dive deeper, and I don't know, Daniel, whoever's sharing the chat, happy to share my contact details, and would love to have more of a one-on-one conversation. But more broadly, in terms of whether it's there or anyone anywhere who's interested, what we do is we spend a lot of time up front with any of our local partners, really understanding what are the particular needs and opportunities. And we very much take an asset-based approach to how we think about our engagements. And in particular, I've spent some time in Cincinnati. I know there's some incredible both entrepreneurs and resources that exist there of what's already in place and what's working, and how do we build off what is working. So that's sort of a key part of it, understanding what have been the challenges or obstacles, what's been tried already. So that would be a big part of that sort of mapping and analysis as an initial kind of starting point, and then identifying that what are some of the key opportunities for moving forward, and who are the people that it would be helpful to engage in that process. So, for example, you all saw the video in Montgomery. We have now created these virtual Montgomery experiences so people are able to engage with the community in Montgomery and help to both fund some of the local opportunities there, local artists, local entrepreneurs, but through really codifying some of those assets in those areas. And we're doing similar work with communities in West Virginia and Atlanta and in other places. And so that there could be a potential of doing something like that in Cincinnati, where we create a virtual experience around the community there and engage different investors and entrepreneurs from both within and outside of the community with the goal of kind of unlocking capital and partnerships within the area. So happy to dive deeper and explore that further.
So actually, yeah, I think it's important to help our audience understand that it's not just about 2 or 3 days spent at X location and the magic is done. There's a lot of preparation that goes into it. And as you mentioned, the research bits, I'm understanding that there's also a fairly long tail of things happening after the event itself to make sure that the process is integral and is transforming, right?
Exactly.
So one question that was coming up is how can this experience be replicated elsewhere, or maybe in more of a Bay Area term, how do you scale up this process?
Well, what's quite exciting about this now being in a virtual context is it makes it much easier to address that question. So we've codified much of our curriculum and process so that we have a general arc for each of our experiences around trust building and mapping of opportunities and challenges and co-creating commitments and next steps. We typically structure the initial engagement, referencing what you were just talking about, Bahid, as a kind of a 9-month engagement where there's the pre-work before the experience itself. So we have modules that people go through online, and I mentioned about the interviews and the surveys, then the 2 to 3 day experience itself, and then the follow-up afterwards. But that's now sort of codified in such a way that the tweaks that we make for each community and the engagement is a component of that builds off the base that we already have in place. So it's meaning that, as I mentioned, we're sort of now pretty much every 10 days we're doing another experience. And so our ability to work with broader groups of people and a broader range of organizations has been opened up in quite a powerful way. So it's exciting.
Great. And so maybe coming back to the role of individuals that you mentioned as consumers or producers, employees or employers, what indications, suggestions you have for people that are doing investments and how they can monitor where that money goes, how money is used in investments? What kind of ideas, suggestions you have for that?
A few elements. I think that there's partly it depends on what aspect of one's portfolio people are looking at. So there's actually a site that was started by a friend of mine just recently, and they've called it My Black Receipt. And they're basically encouraging people to take photos of when they have bought products from Black-owned businesses. And it's been so powerful to see whether those are restaurants or online or whatever it may be. And I use that as just an example because this is people are maybe making $20 transactions. Like these are not at one time, but they've got over $1 million now that has already been aggregated, and this is just in the past couple of weeks. But the ability to, I think so often when we think about this question around investments and how do we align our investments with our values, it can often be perceived that this is only a question for large institutional investors, but actually realizing that there's so much that we're able to do in just our daily lives and our daily purchasing decision-making process that can be a manifestation of the values that we have. So there's things that are as sort of, I would say, as small as kind of looking at the where we're making our purchases and literally the tracking of that and the the movement of that in terms of how we align our values with our investments. There's then when one thinks about on the sort of public portfolio side of things, there are a number of resources. There's a list, there's like a racial justice investing list, where it lists companies that have malpractices as it relates to questions around racial justice. So it's quite easy to just make sure that you don't have investments in your portfolio that have malpractices around this, and then actively investing in companies that do have good practices as it relates to thinking about questions that one cares deeply about, or into new economy solutions or into renewable energy. And then I guess the last part of that would be particularly on the private equity side of things, where you're investing directly into companies, the ability to be able to spend time with the founders. And this is part of our work at One Planet, is to really understand what are the motivations of the founders, how are they thinking about the consequences and intentionality of the decisions that they're making. So thinking about that across all of one's portfolio, of whatever size that may be, being able to embed our values into our investments in those ways.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gina. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come so far. I don't know, Jean, if you wanted to perhaps have a closing question or comments.
Well, I do have one other question, and then we can close it out. Jenna, what about people who are invested in index funds or mutual funds, and they don't really have control over where that money goes? They would like to, but they also have a need to not take the kind of potential risk. They're conservative or moderate investors, so they're in a sense a collective fund, but the actual investments are handled by someone else.
Great question. And what's been powerful to see, even just over the most recent years, is that there's an increasing number of socially responsible, and they're not quite index funds, they're more ETFs, so exchange traded funds. But basically what they do is that they take the portfolio and the broader S&P 500, and will remove companies that are, like I say, with fossil fuels companies, or invested in private prisons, or invested in tobacco and military. And so you're still getting exposed to the majority of the market, but without just some of these industries that typically known as being not aligned from a sort of ethical perspective. So that's one way of doing it, is being able to, and what's powerful is that more and more sort of service providers are getting these requests from clients for more of this development around this product. So there's been quite an increase in terms of the appetite from both retail investors as well as larger institutional investors for these types of products. So there are now an increasing number of investment opportunities where you still get exposure to much of the market, but without these industries invested in.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for spending an hour with us, and this has been very enlightening and also very timely. And I hope that people have gained significantly from this webinar. I know I have. It's a lot to think about, and also a lot to take action on. And people who know me, have been in my classes, know that words are one thing, action is really where the change comes. So I encourage people to really act upon the information, the knowledge that has been gained from this webinar. We are going to skip a week with the webinar series. And so our next, what is it, Daniel? July, whatever that next Saturday is.
July 11th.
July 11th, yes, July 11th. We're going to have an unusual presentation by Ava Darling, who is 16 years old and does a lot of work with youth empowerment and building communities among youth, and integrating that work into the wider community, meaning adults, I guess, non-youth people, And she will be accompanied by her mother, Mary Darling. They will be joining us from somewhere near Toronto, I believe. And Mary, of course, is a filmmaker, along with her husband, most well known for Little Mosque on the Prairie, which was a television series in Canada. So I hope you will join us for that. And once again, Jenna, thank you for spending so much time with us and giving us so much to think about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be in community with you all, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.